Hi, and welcome to MindCube 3D. My name is Dr. John Catone, and today I have the distinct honor to be joined by Dr. Mark Solms, who's recently completed a most ambitious project, a new translation of the complete works of Sigmund Freud. And he was kind enough to grant me an interview to discuss this project. Dr. Mark Solms is a South African psychoanalyst and neuroscientist at the University of Cape Town. And he spent more than 30 years updating the definitive English language version of the complete works of Sigmund Freud. They were launched earlier this year in print and ebook format as a 24-volume set. Dr. Solms is known for his discovery of the brain mechanisms of dreaming and his use of psychoanalytic methods in contemporary neuroscience. He holds the chair of neuropsychology at the University of Cape Town and the Groote Schuur Hospital, and is president of the South African Psychoanalytic Association. He's also research chair of the International Psychoanalytic Association and was a founding editor of the journal Neuropsychoanalysis. So first, Dr. Solms, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me today.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and congratulations on your attempt to pronounce Groote Schuur, which is a completely impossible word.
My apologies. Thank you for that, and again, welcome from Cape Town. So I guess the first thing that I'll ask you, I have a series of questions that are divided into three main segments. So in this first segment, I'd like to maybe cover an overview of your interest in this project in the first place. So if you can tell me a little bit about what inspired you to take on such a massive project in an era where Freudian psychology has been marginalized in many, mainstream psychology departments.
Yes, it's a slightly amusing story because I actually intended to translate Freud's neuroscientific works, which people are not aware how much Freud wrote as a neuroscientist before he developed psychoanalysis. And the very vast bulk of those writings have never been translated into English. So I was engaged in that project, which I began in the late 1980s. And every now and then I came across a paper that Freud had written during that period, which I thought might be of interest to psychoanalysts. And so I published those few translations in the psychoanalytical journals. And so that made people aware that I was doing translation of Freud, and made people in the psychoanalytical world aware that I was doing it. And so then when the publishers of Freud's psychological works, which is a separate matter, his psychoanalytical works, which is a 24-volume set, when they decided they wanted to revise it, it wasn't me who decided, it was them. The publishers decided they wanted to revise it. I was the natural person to turn to because I was, as it were, in the saddle already. So it's not something I chose to do. It's something I was asked to do, and to be honest, I had no idea what I was taking on. I didn't realize just how massive a task it was. And so had I known that it would take me fully 30 years to do it, because I was appointed in 1994, it took me fully 30 years to finish it. I don't know how I would have felt at the time had I known that that's what it would entail. But I'll tell you one other thing, because what I was interested in doing, the building of the bridge between psychoanalysis and the neurosciences that you referred to in your introduction, I was aware that it was probably going to be handy to be Freud's, the editor of the authorized complete psychological works. It probably would give me a certain kind of conservative credibility, that I'm not such a maverick. I'm not one of them. I'm also one of us, kind of thing. And so I think that that was, to the extent that I was motivated myself to do it, I think that was probably the motivation, that this will be good for for my credentials in the psychoanalytic world.
Right. Right. Your street cred.
Yes.
So at your getting deeper into the translation work now. So at your talk at the New York Psychoanalytic Society, you had said translation is interpretation, and that you now believe that you understand Freud better than anybody, and something that I would likely agree with. You also noted that a translator has to choose between honoring the source language, the speaker's language, and the spirit of what he meant, or honoring the target language, with the latter approach giving more weight to a concrete translation of the speaker's exact words. So this leads me to a few questions. So what do you feel are the advantages and disadvantages of each approach?
Well, I think that the first thing to say is that both approaches have advantages and disadvantages. In other words, there's not a right approach and a wrong approach. If you foreground the source language, in this case German, then you are being as literal. You're literally as close as possible, word for word, trying to transliterate into English what the author said in German. So you get a very precise, a very what's the word? It's yeah, it's literal, it's precise, it's exact. There's nobody can say you're putting words into the author's mouth, because you're using the exact words as close as you can, transliterating them into the target language, which in this case is English. But if you use that approach, it ends up being quite stilted and awkward English.
Yeah.
It starts sounding like the funny English that a German would speak,
Right.
because they're not familiar with English.
And it doesn't
Yeah,
offer any help with figurative language, which a lot of psychoanalytic papers and discussions often use figurative language as well. But I'm sorry to cut you off.
yes. No, that's correct. And the other approach, where you foreground the language you're translating into, which is in this case English, it's a matter of trying to convey the thought. That this is the idea, not the words, but the idea that is cloaked in these words. You try to express the same idea sentence by sentence. It's not as if you just rewrite the paper in English. It's not that the idea at that level of abstraction, but sentence by sentence, which is why I say I think I know Freud's thought better than anybody, because that's literally what I had to do, was to ask myself in each sentence, what was he trying to convey here? What is the idea that is being expressed here? And then you try to express that idea in good English. As Freud expressed that idea in good German, you try and express the same idea in good English. But it's no longer word for word. It's no longer so literal. There is, as you said, a need for interpretation. Because you're trying to get to the idea. Well, what if you've got the idea wrong? Maybe you're misrepresenting the idea. Maybe that's not what he was trying to say. But at least you're saying it in proper English, so it reads better.
Right. So you can't approach this simply as a linguist. You have to approach this as someone who is steeped very well and deeply in the subject matter to be able to do that interpretation.
I think that's essential. I don't see how you can translate a technical piece of writing without knowing something about the discipline that is being written about. Otherwise, you're going to make horrible mistakes.
And so you, I gather from this discussion, as well as your talk at the New York Psychoanalytic Society, took the latter approach in terms of trying to interpret the spirit and the meaning of what was meant, and that was different than James Strachey's approach.
No, funnily enough, it was the same approach that Strachey took. So Strachey said in his introduction, in his preface to the original standard edition, which was published in the 60s, well, it started being published in the 50s, he said that he had in his mind the person who's writing, he was translating, he had in his mind, as he put it, an English gentleman of science, of wide education from the middle of the 19th century. So he reimagined Freud as an Englishman. So that's the second of the two approaches that we're taking. He rather than trying to write as a German would in English, he tried to write as an Englishman would. An Englishman of a certain sort of background from a certain era. So I took the same approach, and I must tell you, Freud, not many people know, Freud did a lot of translating himself, especially in his youth. He translated Charcot's work. He translated a substantial portion of Charcot's work from French into German. He also did quite a few translations from Spanish, from English, from Italian, into German, and whenever he also translated John Stuart Mill on the emancipation of women, and he always took that approach himself. Freud did. In other words, he tried to reimagine the author that he was translating as a German speaker. And so that's the approach that Freud took. That's the approach that Strachey took. That's the approach that I took. The equivalent to my revised standard edition of Freud's psychological works, the equivalent in French was edited and translated by somebody named Jean Laplanche. And Laplanche took the other approach. He translated Freud into French in a much more literal way, a much more sort of directly trying to convert it word for word from German into French.
So if I could just ask you to quickly distill what you feel is the biggest difference between your translation and Strachey's translation, whether it was an approach or whether it was an outcome, what would you say?
Well, the first thing to make clear is that what I did was not to replace Strachey's translation, but rather to revise it. So wherever there were errors, Strachey was an old man when he translated, when he produced the standard edition. And he was also pretty nearly blind at that stage. So he often misread things. I mean, like literally, visually misread and left out bits. So that's the easiest thing to say, is that I corrected all of the mistakes. The other easy thing to say is that there were several titles that were not included in the original standard edition, which I've added. And of course, in those instances, I simply translated them from scratch. But I translated them in the same idiom, in the same style, to be consistent with the Strachey translations. And then the most complex part of it is that there's a certain point at which it becomes ambiguous as to whether Strachey has made an error or whether he's made a judgment call, which you might or might not agree with. So in those cases, where I felt, look, this is just a controversial issue. This could be translated this way, or it could be translated that way. Something is lost, either way. It's because there's no two languages map onto each other directly. So there's always a need for some adjustment in order to render the idea in the target language. And so in cases like that, where I felt this is really a matter of opinion, then what I did was, without it being too obtrusive, I didn't want to make a whole lot of footnotes. So what I did was I made little superscript T, which standing for translation notes, and then that alerts the reader to the fact that there is an end note in the 24th volume, the final volume. There were a long list of notes in which I discuss the controversy or discuss the ambiguity. So the reader is alerted to the fact that this could be translated this way, it could be translated that way. So-and-so has suggested this should be translated this way. Strachey suggested it should be translated that way. This is why. This is how others have done it. So just readers who are interested in such matters, they can be educated about what's at stake. Then there are borderline cases between controversial translations and erroneous translations. I think that the outstanding example of that kind is the German word Trieb, which Strachey translated as instinct. And that's a fundamental concept. And by the way, let me just pause for a moment and make clear that the controversy over the translation of Freud pivots on the translation of certain technical terms. So I'm using one such example now, the example of Trieb, which Strachey translated as instinct. For me, that just crossed the line between sort of a matter of opinion and a matter of fact. I think it is a mistranslation to translate the German word Trieb by the English instinct is to render it, is to turn it into a slightly different concept. So I've translated Trieb as drive rather than instinct. And there you have it. Anybody who's in the mental field will know that a drive and an instinct are not the same thing. So that gives you a flavor of the sorts of things that are at stake.
Right. A subtle difference, but an important difference.
Yes, especially since there's another German word, instinct, which can only be translated as instinct. And so Strachey translated both instinct and Trieb by one English word, instinct. So not only does instinct have a different denotation from Trieb, but also you're conflating two different concepts in the original German. They're two different terms, which are both rendered by the English instinct. And so you don't realize when Freud is saying instinct and when he's saying Trieb. Just to be clear, for those who are not familiar with this, a drive is a sort of a push. It's an urge. It's an inclination. And then you have to find like something like let's say hunger. It's an impulse, a demand. And then you have to decide, what am I going to do about this? There's a response to the demand. And an instinct is in the nature of a response. It's a stereotyped, inbuilt response that we're born with. But it's not the drive, it's the action that satisfies the drive. That's really the essence of the difference between the two terms.
Can you,
I see I'm getting sun shining behind me. I'm going to swing my computer so that it doesn't look so. And let me put this off. Oh, no, that's too dark. There you go.
Let's see. Okay. Actually, I think the glare is greater now than it was before. I think you were okay before. You were blocking most of the sun.
The problem is that the sun is moving at this time of day. I'm very sorry. That's what happens.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
If you can just maybe help me real quick. So the word that was translated into instinct, and you had translated it into drive. So the German word is Trieb.
The German word that Freud used is Trieb, T-R-I-E-B, and Strachey translated that as instinct, and I've translated it as drive.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure I had the spelling on that correct. So moving on, you alluded to some new works that you had discovered and translated that Strachey didn't. And I think in your previous talk, you would put up the number of works that you translated versus Strachey. And I think you had discovered and translated close to double of what he had originally translated.
You're referring to two different matters there. The one is that the bibliography of Freud's writings, amusingly, the bibliography of Freud's writings continues to grow after his death, because correspondences and so on, continue to be published. The bibliography of Freud's works that I have included in the new edition is more than double the length of the one that Strachey included. It's partly for the reason that I just said, that there are new Freud works being published all the time, but it's also because there are many Freud works that Strachey wasn't aware of. Now, those are mostly neuroscientific works. I mean, there are hundreds of neuroscientific works that Strachey was not aware of. So that's the one story, is that I've compiled a bibliography of Freud's works, which is much more complete than the original one, and in fact more than double the length of it. Separately is the question of new works that I have included in the revised standard edition. That's by no means have I doubled the size of the standard edition. I've added 56 new titles.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on the topic of these, some of these new works, which stand out in terms of any that fundamentally change the way that you see Freud, either Freud the man or his theories? And, if so, how?
Yes, I wouldn't say that any of the new works that I've included. Let me just again go back to the distinction I drew a minute ago. Freud's neuroscientific works are largely unknown because they're almost entirely untranslated. Those works, when you see that what Freud wrote as a psychoanalyst, in the context of everything that came before, you understand radically differently some of the basic assumptions that he started with, because you see where they came from. So the thing that really it changed my understanding of Freud's theories was the early neuroscientific works published from 1878 until 1900. When it comes to the psychological works that I've added, nothing is revolutionary there. But certainly they I wouldn't say radically changed, but they certainly adjusted my view of Freud, the person, mainly insofar as we all know, from a modern standpoint, Freud, is pretty homophobic, sexist, misogynist, classist, racist even. So it was very gratifying to find several things. The outstanding one was an interaction between him and his committee, the committee that ran international psychoanalysis. A series of letters between Freud and other members of that committee on the question of whether or not homosexuals should be allowed to train as psychoanalysts. And when I trained, which was I started training in the 1980s in psychoanalysis, it was still the case in the 1980s that homosexuals were not permitted to train as analysts, which is pretty shocking. It only changed in the 1990s. So it was extremely interesting to discover that Freud had argued vigorously against this prejudice in those correspondences with his committee. And when I say vigorously, I'm really not overstating it. Freud was really appalled that other members of his committee were of the view that your sexual orientation determined whether or not you were suitable to be a psychoanalyst. So that's one instance. And there were a few things related to that. I found I didn't discover this; it was already found, but I included it in the Freud works. A letter written to Freud by the mother of a young homosexual man from the States, and she wanted Freud to treat him in the sense of, conversion therapy. And Freud wrote a very moving response to her, explaining to her that it's not an illness to be homosexual. It's not something that you get cured from, and that if you want your son to come to me for treatment, then my aim will be to help him to adjust to the fact that it's very hard to be homosexual in this heteronormative world. So he's much more enlightened about homosexuality than I think most of us give him credit for. There were also there was a case of a man, a professor in Vienna, who was found guilty of moral insanity, and the local newspaper in Vienna, or one of them, asked Freud to comment on this case because the man had been found guilty of moral insanity on the basis of having slept with a boy, having sexual relations with the boy. In other words, the basis for the crime, was that he had committed a homosexual act. And Freud, in response to the interviewer in the newspaper, said, there's no crime. It is outrageous that homosexuality is a crime. It's not a crime. It's not an illness. It's just one of the ways in which the sexual drive can express itself. What is criminal in this case is that it was a boy, an underage boy, and he said the fact that this professor had sexual relations with a girl of equivalent age, that would have been the problem. It's not her gender or his gender so much as the age. So there again, you see, I think that's a perfectly modern view. There were also the Austrian government was considering the legislation about marriage law reform. Marriage law, as you might imagine, in 19th century Austria, was rather biased in favor of the husband and in favor of men. And so Freud was asked to comment on the law as it stood. And it was really a strident defense of women's rights. So I'm sorry, I'm probably going on for too long. The point is that the Freud came across to me as more enlightened than I had realized on social and sexual prejudices of his time. That's probably the way, in addition to the neuroscientific bit,
Right.
on the personal side, this is what impressed me.
So these new letters and correspondences, in conjunction with the overall translation project, I guess, would you say that Freud's perspective on a lot of these issues, gender identification, sexual orientation, race, and so on and so forth, that his perspectives were more nuanced than what he was previously given credit for, or in a similar way that Strachey had mistranslated, in your opinion, the word trieb to be instinct instead of drive. Do you think he was mistranslated in certain respects? And that's where this kind of reductionistic impression of Freud as a misogynist and homophobic and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I don't want to overstate the case. I think that we have to recognize Freud was a man of his time. I think that on the matter of race, certainly there are passages in Freud's writing which can only be described as racist from a modern point of view. Likewise, when I say that he was more enlightened about women's rights and more enlightened about the risks and the extent of sexism, I mean by comparison with his compatriots and by comparison with the sort of the view that has been passed down. So by including these things which were more marginal, where he was writing sort of speaking from the heart and conveying something of his own personal view rather than some kind of organized scientific theory, you see that he really was much more enlightened than we give him credit for. But that doesn't mean that he would meet contemporary standards. I think that to be fair, we still have to recognize that Freud was a man of his time.
So earlier we spoke about how the popularity of Freud and Freudian style therapies had declined through the 20th century. However, now in the 21st century, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, there seems to be a renewed interest in Freud. So first, where do you think this is coming from? Why do you think that may be the case?
Well, I suppose partly it's just a matter of how pendulums work. There was an excessive reverence for Freud, and then there was an excessive bashing of Freud. So it's a kind of a correction of both extremes. But I think perhaps more interestingly, there has been a growing, not only in psychiatry, I think in the general public too, a growing disenchantment with psychopharmacology. I think psychopharmacology overpromised and underdelivered, perhaps just like psychoanalysis did in the first half of the 20th century. So too in the second half, I think that the claims of how we can correct chemical imbalances and then everything's hunky-dory again have not proven to be so. So I think that there's a renewed interest in the complexities of what goes wrong in the life of the mind, and looking for less shallow solutions, a deeper understanding of the mechanisms at work. I think that is probably, alongside that pendulum swing thing that I mentioned, I think that it's more of a disenchantment with biological psychiatry and therefore giving the other side a second look than anything else.
Well, you say biological psychiatry, but I think really at the other end of that pendulum are approaches like behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and so on and so forth. And as a psychologist who was trained both in Freudian style therapies, psychodynamic therapy, as well as cognitive behavioral and behavior therapy and DBT and so on and so forth, I feel that I have a unique perspective on the advantages and disadvantages of each. With, I think from the Freudian perspective and the psychodynamic approaches and the object relations approaches, I think they spend a disproportionate amount of time on the assessment part of psychotherapy and perhaps not enough on the intervention part of psychotherapy. Whereas in a complementary sort of a way, I think behavior therapy and cognitive behavior therapy are disproportionately focused on intervention before they even really know sometimes why they're intervening here or what they're intervening for. And so I think through the 20th century, especially as we've the 20th century was particularly STEM focused, science and technology, and a focus on concrete things. Psychoanalysis was more sort of ineffable and analytical, obviously, whereas behavior therapy was more concrete and intervention focused. I think at a certain point people maybe lost patience with just analysis for the sake of analysis. But now I think we've seen the result of what happens when you target interventions at symptoms as opposed to the core problems. And then the question becomes, well, how do you get to the core problem? I think Freud and those style therapies, object relations and psychodynamic, have a better approach in terms of getting to the core. And it takes longer. Talking about over-promising and under-delivering, a lot of behavior therapy and cognitive behavior therapy are limited to 12 sessions, or at least they were. I mean, you haven't even finished your intake in 12 sessions in an analytic style therapy. So, so with the renewed interest in Freud and psychoanalysis, has been some entertainment and shows and movies. If you had seen Freud on Netflix and Freud's Last Session with Anthony Hopkins, I don't know if you had seen either of those, if you had any thoughts about what they got right, what they got wrong.
I'm embarrassed to tell you I have not seen either of them, so I can't comment on them. But I can agree with you on two scores. First of all, to go back to your previous comment about CBT versus psychodynamic therapies, I agree with everything you said there. I think that that's correct, and I think that what we perhaps don't sufficiently admit to is that cognitive behavioral therapists are slowly taking on board more of what psychoanalysis had to offer, and vice versa. I think the psychoanalysts are equally loath to admit that they're slowly practicing a little bit more of what the other side did. And that's a jolly good thing. I think that what we're moving towards is a more integrated, less of this kind of us and them approach to psychotherapy, which is frankly silly. But the other thing I agree with in what you've just said is that there is a resurgence of interest in the broader sort of cultural milieu in Freud and in psychoanalysis and so on. So those two, that Netflix thing and the Anthony Hopkins film, there is symptomatic of that. But there's a lot of that about. I'm not really sure why. I'd be interested to know if you have any views about why that's the case. But I'll tell you what I think. This is not an answer as to the why, but I think that the thing I was saying earlier about this kind of revering of Freud and then this bashing of Freud, I think that if we can get to a position where we recognize that this was somebody who's very interesting, who had very interesting ideas, but they're ideas of a different era, and we can start treating Freud in relation to contemporary psychology as we might treat Darwin in relation to contemporary biology, or Newton in relation to contemporary physics. These were towering figures of who founded a discipline, or at least founded a kind of a whole paradigm within a discipline. And I hope that's what we're moving towards, a kind of a respect for what somebody who did something very big, but who is of the past, not of the present.
Yeah, I think I would agree wholeheartedly. I think we run into problems with human nature in that human nature has a tendency towards reductionism because we don't have the bandwidth to understand people and theories in their full complexity. And so, we reduce people to very short, pithy, oversimplified representations of who they actually are, because that's all most people can remember. And, but you eliminate so much of the truth of what a person or what a theory is. And so so long as we are, liable to this reductionism, we're always, I think, going to have these pendulum swings, because and this happens politically as well. Obviously, we have the presidential elections, happening in the United States, and that's a whole other pendulum swing. But we won't get into that now. But this seems to be the way that we as humans operate, and people kind of break down into tribes and into camps. And each one has a part of the truth that the other is not seeing, because each of them have, reduced a person or a theory into something that's most comfortable to them and, have ignored the rest, right? So this is a problem of human nature. So I'm in agreement with you. But if you end up checking out one of the entertainment pieces on Freud, the series on Netflix was actually done in German. And so that might be more authentic than uh, the Hopkins movie, but so you might find interesting perspectives on how they translated him, in the series. So
I look forward, now that I no longer have to spend my every waking hour translating, I hope to find time shortly to be able to watch them both.
So one of the topics that we touched on tangentially, we really didn't get into yet, but you got into more in your talk at the New York Psychoanalytic Society, is this notion of the false scientization of Freud. And so, if I understood you correctly from your previous talk, you felt that Strachey's translation partly contributed to this. Do you feel that Freud himself contributed to this at all?
I think that there are two slightly different issues at stake here. The one is whether Freud was actually trying to write as a scientist. Was he really trying to, that these theories that he was setting out, these treatments that he was recommending and so on, did he really think they were evidence-based? Did he really see a continuity between what he was doing as a psychoanalyst and what he was doing as a neuroscientist? In all of those respects, the claim has been made that Freud was a humanist, Freud was a literary figure, Freud was a man of culture, he was steeped in anthropology and mythology and philosophy and so on, that we distort him to represent him as a natural scientist. I have to say, as far as that argument is concerned, I don't agree. I think Freud self-consciously very much thought he was doing science. And he was, as I have read all of the neuroscientific works that preceded the psychoanalytical works, when you see the continuities in terms of the way he wrote, the terms that he used, how the psychoanalytical project grew out of his neuroscientific work, I think Freud really did aspire to establish a natural science of the human subject, of subjectivity, what he called psychical reality. He wanted to include this thing called experience in natural science. It's part of nature, and it must be possible to discover the laws that underlie it. The second question is whether he succeeded. Did he actually establish a viable scientific theory? And I think that's an entirely different question. And the thing for me pivots on the methods that were available to Freud. Karl Popper famously described psychoanalysis as pseudoscience, and he said it was pseudoscience because it was unfalsifiable. And I think he was right, but it was unfalsifiable using only Freud's methods. The psychoanalytic method is not an experimental method, and it's therefore, it doesn't set up two competing falsifiable hypotheses. It just isn't such a method. And the methods that we have now were not available then. So for me, that's a crucial part of my own life's work. My main aim in life, by the way, is not to translate anyone. My main aim in life is to do science myself. And the science that has most interested me has been, to what extent can we use the methods now available to test and develop the theories, the first pass theories that Freud bequeathed to us. I think they were not sufficiently evidence-based. They were certainly not sufficiently rigorously tested. But rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater, I'm interested in seeing, well, let's see what can we do with the methods we have now. and render with those methods render these theories falsifiable. So let's get on with that job.
So yeah, let's get on with it actually. So you are a founding father of the field of neuropsychoanalysis. So maybe if you can tell us a little bit about what that is about in terms of looking for the neurological correlates of some of the drives or concepts, or in some cases dreams that Freud touched on from a more subjective perspective. So tell me about your work in that area.
Well, let's use dreams as an example. The Freud claimed that behind what he called the manifest dream, the consciously remembered dream, he said behind that is what he called latent dream thoughts. In other words, there are mental processes at work that you have to infer from the manifest content and the associations that the dreamer provides you with, the free associations in connection with the manifest content of the dream. Freud said that behind that, there is a heartfelt, to put it mildly, wish, desire, of a rather urgent kind, and of a rather embarrassing kind. The sorts of desires that we don't, and urges that we don't readily admit to. Now, that was an extremely unlikely claim. I mean, behind every dream is a repressed sexual wish, says Freud. And my dreams don't look like that, and this was Popper's whole point. He was saying, there's no evidence that you can use to falsify the theory, because the psychoanalyst doesn't look at the manifest evidence. They say behind that dream, I can infer that there is this urge. Now, my very earliest research was using modern methods to look at the dreaming brain, and the kinds of things that I'm talking about. Well, it started with me discovering that damage to a certain part of the brain leads to loss of dreaming, and the part of the brain in question is part of the medial forebrain bundle. It's called the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system. So having realized that damage to this part of the brain leads to a cessation of dreaming, then it was possible to use pharmacological probes to see, is this dopamine system really the thing that drives the dream process? Giving research participants dopamine agonists and dopamine antagonists, looking at the effects on dreaming, then doing positron emission tomography and seeing which parts of the brain are most active during dreams. What it turns out is that this part of the brain, this system, the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system, unequivocally is the main driving force behind dreams. And that is widely known as the brain reward system. It is Kent Berridge calls it the wanting system. Jaak Panksepp called it the seeking system. So this is, if there's any system in the brain that would be equivalent to Freud's libidinal drive, it's this one. So there was a striking, by using new methods, a striking confirmation, not of the way Freud put it, that this repressed sexual wishes, but the mere fact that there is behind the dream, behind every dream, is this positive motivational urge that we call the brain reward system, is really surprisingly consistent with what Freud thought he could see behind the associations of his patients. By the same token, I have to say that using those same sorts of methods, that same general approach, we've also found things which are entirely inconsistent with Freud's claims. So you mentioned drive. Freud thought that there were two drives at work in the mind, and every single pleasure-seeking impulse, according to Freud, was sexual. At bottom, all pleasure-seeking, looking for pleasure for its own sake, even in food or in children's games, or all of this for Freud was sexual. he had a very wide interpretation of what sexuality is. If it's pleasure seeking in its own right, in and for itself, then it's sexual. So we now know that there are many different pleasures in the brain with different circuits and different chemistries, and you cannot reduce them all to one. It's entirely unhelpful to try to reduce all of the different pleasures that the human and the mammalian brain is given to reduce them to one category is a big mistake, and that's not a detail. To say that Freud was wrong about sexuality and it's his all-pervasive kind of way of interpreting it is not a detail. It's saying that was a pretty fundamental mistake that Freud made. So using these methods, we're able to confirm where he got things right, disconfirm where he got things wrong, and in this way continue the project to develop a scientific psychology which pivots on the real lived life of the mind. I think that's the great value of Freud's approach to psychology. Is it was an attempt to take as a starting point lived experience, the actual, rather than like the behaviorists, these kind of like carefully controlled stimulus response sort of things, which are so far removed from the reality of what actually motivates us, what actually makes things go well or badly for us in mental development and emotional development. I think that to advance that part of psychology, that approach to psychology using better methods is a very valuable thing to do.
So your answer kind of segues into a couple of different areas of questioning for me, but I want to be respectful of your time. We're coming up to the hour mark. If you are on a time crunch, we can break off in the next couple of minutes. If you have another 15, 20 minutes, let me know. There are a couple of questions. I want to be as respectful as I can of your time.
Yes, I can carry on until 10 past the hour.
Okay, so that gives us about 15 minutes. So, it's you were talking about the two drives that Freud spoke of that he felt were really fundamental to human beings, and I'm assuming you're talking about Eros and Thanatos. And so he had focused on the libidinal Eros part of it, but some of his other contemporaries like Otto Rank, and then later psychoanalysts like Ernest Becker focused more on the Thanatos part. And one of my favorite books is the Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, and he focuses more on the Thanatos part. And it's I think both Otto Rank and Becker seem to give a little bit more respect for the place of religion in people's lives than Freud did. Freud was famously atheistic, and that was part of his formed part of the rift, I guess, between him and Jung at a certain point. But it's kind of ironic to me because even though Freud fashioned himself as a scientist, and he was, so much of psychoanalytic theory, I think, is born out of the cultural anthropology and philosophical stuff that I would think dovetails very well with religion and myth making and things like that. So it seems that Otto Rank and Becker were more if not forgiving, more tolerant of the usefulness of religion in people's lives, particularly for addressing this primal fear of death. So do you believe that, where do you think that Freud's I guess antipathy towards religion comes from? And do you feel that maybe it's a defense mechanism against something else in his life?
Well, let's start with that latter point. Freud came from a very devout family. In fact, there are many rabbis in his lineage, and they were his family was also not very well off. They were quite short of money, and came from the east, from what was then called Moravia, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now part of the Czech Republic. And why I mention that is that the Jews from the east, they were called Ostjuden. They were kind of like within the whole German-speaking world, they were the kind of least the least enlightened, the least urbane, the least progressive, and so on, the least integrated also into German high society and Austro-Hungarian high society. So I think that when you ask, is there a defense mechanism, I think Freud was reacting against this kind of, he recast himself from being, from a sort of lower middle class, at best, Ostjuden kind of background of very devout kind. He saw this as backward. And he reinvented himself as a gentleman of science in Vienna, and a professor, and so on. So I think that was part of it. It was partly a reaction against his class and social religious origins. But that's only part of the story. I think that there's much else to be said. Freud, given his approach to psychology, trying to understand, why is it that somebody develops this weird and wonderful symptom? Why is it that people have these myths? Why is it that we dream the things that we do? I think he just took the same approach to religion. It was, why do we have these belief systems? For him, it was a scientific question, a psychological question of trying to understand, why do we believe? And remember, I'm not speaking only of the Judeo-Christian beliefs. Freud was interested in all these different, like the old totemic religions, and he was very interested in the gods of the ancient Greeks and all of that. So I think that it was a sincere attempt also by Freud to try to understand, why does the human mind construct these stories? What needs are being satisfied here? And the denial of death, or the denial of mortality, certainly is one of them. And the idea that we have a great parent in the sky looking after us and all of that. It's easy to see why Freud came to the conclusions that he did. But I think that yet another issue. So the one is, was it a defense against something? And I've told you what I think it was a defense against. The other is, this atheist Freud was partly just a scientist trying to understand some mental phenomenon. But I think that the third issue is rather more of a clinical one. Is it such a bad thing for people to have beliefs that enable them to cope with things which are pretty dreadful, like mortality? It's and also to cope with the unknown. There's so much that we just cannot know, about the nature of our being and the meaning of it all, and and so on. I think that Freud was not intolerant in fact, I think he was rather empathic when it comes to the clinical question of what. And I'm saying this because I'm busy translating for my sins. Believe it or not, I'm still translating. I'm busy translating a correspondence between Freud and Pfister, Oscar Pfister, who was a Christian pastor in Zurich. And in this, which is partially, by the way, translated already. Some of those letters are available. So if anyone wants to check out what I'm talking about, that correspondence with Freud and a deeply religious Christian minister, you see a great sort of understanding on Freud's part of the very valuable role that religion plays in people's lives and in society. So I think that's a separate question from the scientific, like, why do people do this? And is it a bad thing? I don't think that Freud thought it was a bad thing. But then there was that childhood business, that the defense that we're speaking of, that was also in the mix.
If we have time for one more question that
Sure, sure.
might, bring everything all together. So as you had been talking about the different approaches to translation, my first thought is, boy, you would have as unique perspective as anybody about the various translations of the Bible, which, is a work that's probably shorter than Freud's collected writings. And so, that in and of itself is, very interesting to me. But you had also said in one of your previous talks, you expect critiques of your translation and very respectful of that. And it led me to think about, I come from a Catholic background, but my wife comes from a Jewish background. And so I've gotten to know Judaism very extensively over the last 20, 30 years. And, in Judaism, and Freud was, as you, referenced earlier, was Jewish, or at least culturally Jewish, raised Jewish. In Judaism, they have a book called the Talmud, which is essentially a book of opinions, they would call midrash, of the established scriptures, because those scriptures were passed down through oral tradition, but over the years and in different parts of the world, the esteemed rabbis at the time had different interpretations, because there are gaps and there are holes in the actual stories. And you have to figure out, well, how are we going to interpret these gaps or holes or these ambiguities? And so, I had wondered if, for those who may be critics of yours, if, creating a Talmud of sorts for Freud's collected works here in your translation is a way to sort of have your cake and eat it too, where they, these unique perspectives, I think, could offer something, but you should also be given credit for this tremendous achievement and accomplishment as being singular above, all else. So I was wondering if you had, thought about that in any way.
It's a very interesting point that you make. If you look at the Revised Standard Edition, it looks Talmudic. There's the Freud text, the translation of what Freud wrote. Then there's an editorial apparatus around that. So the Freud text is the Torah, and then there's this Talmudic apparatus around it. In the margins, I've got, just as you find in the Talmud, there's all this marginalia, which refers to the 24th volume, where there are commentaries upon the translation. Also the footnotes giving all these explanatory sort of cross references and so on. Each paper is introduced by the editor, by me, and before me, Strachey, sort of interpreting the text before you read the text. So yes, I think that there is something of that, something of that tradition in it. But I would like to add to that, though, that so I think that's fine. There you have the Freud text, which you translate as faithfully as you can. Then you have an editorial apparatus, which is an interpretation, a commentary. It's not the Freud text, as long as it's clear what the difference is between the two. But the risk of it becoming like a religion, which is certainly a risk when it comes to psychoanalysis. I mean, Freud was deified almost, during certain periods of our history by certain sections of the psychiatric and psychological communities. So, I'm also very mindful of that in my role as the editor and translator of the Revised edition. I don't want to become a rabbinical scholar, So that's why I draw attention in our discussion to the fact that, that's part of what I've done in my life. But the other part is I'm a scientist, and I'm much more interested in testing these ideas, using the methods we have at our disposal today in order to build a better science of the mind. So we pay homage to our forebears, and we recognize that we're building upon what they did. But then, we also have to move on. And so I'm looking in my own professional activities. I'm looking, I think, more to the future than to the past. I don't want to become a Freud scholar and to end there. I want to take what Freud has left to us seriously, and integrate it with what others have left for us, and then build upon it all so that we can have a better science of the mind and a better therapeutic armamentarium to help people in distress.
That's a good way to end. I would like to thank you so much for your time today and your generosity. In a second, I'll stop the recording and then maybe we can chat for a minute. But once again, thank you so much for your generosity and your time. And I wish you all of the best. And I hope your translation becomes something that future generations will really turn to and will be the foundation of their new understanding of Freud. So best of luck to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your interest.